Welcome to another Reddit horror story, everyone. Tonight, I have something truly unsettling to share, straight from the depths of Reddit. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and brace yourself for a journey into fear. This happened to me. I looked around at the others. They all nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. Everyone had noticed the same thing: the cowboy, always standing near the posts, never moving, just watching us from the shadows. I wanted to chalk it up to nerves, to the tension that builds when you're out in the middle of nowhere in the dark. But there was something about the way it felt that night, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the cowboy, it was the air, the oppressive weight of the silence, the thick darkness closing in around us. We kept walking, but the unease began to gnaw at me. Each flicker of movement in the trees, every rustle of the underbrush made my heart race. The others had started to slow down, their laughter and jokes fading away. It was as if the canyon itself had swallowed the sound. The only noise now was the sound of our own breathing, labored in the cold night air. And then it happened. We reached a clearing, a small patch of open ground where the moonlight managed to pierce through the canopy of trees. It was there, standing in the middle of the clearing, as if waiting for us, the cowboy. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking toward us. It was slow at first, like a shadow stretching out in the darkness, but it was unmistakable. The tall figure moved with a strange, unnatural grace. The brim of his hat hid most of his face, but I could see his broad shoulders, his long coat swaying with each step. The closer he got, the more I could feel the weight of his presence. The others were frozen, staring at him, their faces pale under the faint light. "Is that real?" one of my friends whispered, his voice shaky. I couldn't answer. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, from the way he seemed to glide across the ground, leaving no footprints behind. His movements were too smooth, too deliberate. It was like he wasn't walking on the earth, but above it, just barely touching the ground. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in place. Time seemed to stretch on forever, but suddenly, the cowboy stopped. He was no more than 20 feet away from us, his presence overwhelming. We could feel the cold coming off him, the same unnatural chill that seemed to fill the air. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, like I was suffocating under the weight of his gaze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating through my body. And then I heard it. A voice, low and gravelly, like the sound of someone speaking from a great distance. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Leave, now." The words hung in the air, echoing in my mind. I couldn't tell if it was real, if it was coming from him, or if it was just the fear messing with my head. But the others had heard it too. They started to back away, slowly at first, but then faster, more frantic, as if they could feel the danger creeping closer. And that's when it happened. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, but then it became undeniable. The earth started to tremble, just a little, enough to make us stumble. It was like something was moving beneath the surface. Something large, something ancient. The cowboy didn't move. He just stood there, watching us with those invisible eyes. But the ground was alive. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was like I was stuck in place, my body refusing to obey my commands. I wanted to scream, to shout for my friends to move, but my voice was lost, swallowed up by the silence. And then I saw it. In the trees, shadows moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. More figures, tall, dark, and formless. At first, I thought they were more of the Cowboys kind, but then I realized the truth: they weren't human. They were something else entirely. They moved in unison, shifting through the trees like ghosts, their forms indistinct but their presence undeniable. I could feel their eyes on me, on all of us, cold and unblinking. "Go! Run!" I finally managed to shout, my voice hoarse with panic. I didn't wait to see if anyone else moved. I turned and bolted, my legs finally responding, my heart in my throat. The others followed, stumbling over rocks and roots as we fled down the narrow trail, away from the clearing, away from the cowboy and the shadows in the trees. We ran without stopping, the sounds of our footsteps echoing in the night, the sound of our ragged breathing louder than anything else. The cold air burned in my lungs, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. When we finally reached the trailhead, breathless and shaken, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. We all knew what had happened. We had ventured too far into Black Star Canyon, into a place where the land wasn't just wild, it was alive with something else. Something ancient and unforgiving. As we piled into the car and drove away, the forest behind us seemed to loom, dark and menacing, as if it were waiting for us to come back, to finish what we had started. I never went back to Black Star Canyon after that night, and I never will. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, or when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear the cowboy's voice in my mind, low and gravelly, warning me, "Leave. Now." That's the story. That's the memory that haunts me. And I know, deep down, that the forest is still out there, waiting, watching. Just beyond the edge of the world, in the dark corners of Black Star Canyon. And I wonder, who else might hear the cowboy's voice one day? At that moment, I finally spoke up. "I've been seeing him too, that cowboy." We all stopped dead in our tracks, frozen in the middle of the road, the cold air surrounding us like a suffocating blanket. The darkness swallowed us whole, the trees looming like towering figures, their silhouettes bending and shifting in the faint light of our flashlights. For a brief, agonizing moment, no one said anything. The silence was deafening, heavy with an unseen presence. We stood there, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on us, each of us too afraid to move, too terrified to speak. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my chest, almost as loud as the pounding in my ears. The air felt thick, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, something waiting for the right moment to strike. And that's when things took a turn for the worse. Just as we were about to turn around and head back, one of my friends, Jason, suddenly ripped off his shirt, his eyes wide with panic. He let out a strangled scream that sent a jolt of fear through me. He was clawing at his skin as though something was stinging him, desperate, frantic. His breath was shallow, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Something stung me. Something's stinging me." We froze, turning to look at him, not knowing what to do. His face was twisted in terror, his hands frantically trying to pry at his skin, as though the pain was unbearable. He kept shouting, his voice rising in pitch. "Like a bee, a hornet. It's stinging me." We quickly turned off our flashlights, our eyes adjusting to the dark. The beam of light faded, leaving us in complete blackness, the moonlight barely filtering through the trees. It was a long, unsettling moment before we could see anything clearly. We gathered around Jason, our breaths shallow, each of us nervously glancing over our shoulders, afraid that something was watching us. And that's when we saw it. 3 deep scratches, running diagonally from his shoulder to his opposite hip. The gashes were raw, almost impossibly deep, the skin torn open as though by something with claws. Blood was dripping from the wounds, staining his skin, running down in rivulets. Jason gasped for breath, his face pale with shock, his eyes wide with fear as he looked at us, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Did one of you do this?" I stammered, my voice shaky. But no one said anything. We all stood there, stunned, looking at each other in disbelief. There was no animal in sight, no sign of any insect or creature that could have caused such damage. No hornet buzzing in the air, no angry bear or coyote lurking in the woods. It was as if something had reached out from the darkness itself and slashed him something we couldn't see. Something that was still out there, hidden in the blackness. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves around us, but it did nothing to calm our nerves. If anything, it made everything worse, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the night. The trees swayed ominously, and the forest seemed to whisper, as though the land itself was alive, watching, waiting. "We need to get out of here," Jason gasped, still clutching at his side, his voice trembling. But it wasn't just his injuries that terrified him, it was the fear of whatever had done this to him, whatever had been waiting in the dark. We all agreed, silently. There was no way we were staying any longer. The sense of dread that had been hanging over us ever since we'd entered Black Star Canyon was now palpable. Something was wrong. Something was out there with us, and it was not a thing that could be explained. Without another word, we turned around, our legs moving in unison, our steps quick and heavy as we made our way back to the car. The forest seemed to close in around us as we walked, the trees pressing closer, their twisted branches like bony fingers reaching for us. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy above, leaving us in almost total darkness, our flashlights flickering as we tried to navigate the narrow, uneven path. With every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing just out of reach of the light. The air felt thick with an invisible presence, and I could feel my pulse quickening. We didn't dare look back, though. None of us spoke a word, and for a moment, it was as if the night itself had swallowed us whole, leaving us isolated in the eerie, oppressive silence. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our feet and the distant rustle of branches. We didn't dare look back, though. None of us spoke a word, and for a moment, it was as if the night itself had swallowed us whole, leaving us isolated in the eerie, oppressive silence. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under our feet and the distant rustle of branches. When we finally reached the car, I almost couldn't believe we were there. The headlights seemed like a beacon of safety in the overwhelming darkness. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut. Our breath ragged and fast as we tried to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation for it. There was no logical reason for what we'd seen, for the strange feeling of being watched, for the scratches that Jason had suffered. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine sputtered to life, the headlights cutting through the shadows, casting long, eerie beams into the night. We didn't speak as we pulled out onto the road, the forest now far behind us, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the image of the cowboy from my mind, the figure I'd seen, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam, his silhouette stark and still. The cowboy wasn't just a figment of our imagination. He was something else. Something we couldn't understand. Something that was tied to Black Star Canyon, to the darkness that seemed to inhabit that place. And as we drove, I could swear I saw him again, standing at the edge of the road in the rearview mirror. A shadow in the distance, his presence lingering like a phantom, watching us, waiting. But by the time I turned to look, There was nothing there, just the empty stretch of road, the trees swaying in the breeze. We made it back to town without any further incident, but the unease never left. The moment we pulled into the driveway of my house, the world seemed too quiet, too normal, like everything we'd just experienced had been a dream. But it wasn't. The scratches on Jason's back were real. We were all witnesses to something we couldn't explain. The shadow cowboy, the scratches, the feeling of being watched. It was as if we had crossed some invisible line, entered a place that wasn't meant for us, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. And once you've seen something like that, once you've felt that presence, you can never forget it. The memory clings to you, like a shadow that never fades. I haven't been back to Black Star Canyon since that night, at least. Not at night. The thought of stepping foot into that place after dark fills me with a cold, creeping dread that I can't shake. I've only ventured there during the day, when the sunlight chases away the shadows, when everything feels safe and ordinary. But even then, I can still feel the weight of the darkness that lingers in that place. It's funny how a place can change depending on the time of day, how something that seems so normal can transform when the sun dips below the horizon. During the day, Black Star Canyon is just another stretch of wilderness, a popular spot for hikers and nature lovers. The sun filters through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirp in the distance, and the air smells of pine and fresh earth. It's easy to forget what lies beneath the surface when the world is bathed in daylight. But when the sun sets, everything changes. The trees grow taller, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal hands, blocking out the light. The sounds of nature fall silent, and an oppressive stillness takes over the canyon. It's in these moments when the whispers begin, when the very air seems to hold its breath. It's when the shadows stretch longer and the dark corners of the canyon become alive with things that shouldn't be there. And I can't help but wonder, is the cowboy still out there? Does he still walk the woods of Black Star Canyon, waiting for someone else to cross his path? I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to find out. Let me take you back to that night, the night that changed everything. It was late in the evening, the sky already darkening as I made my way through the canyon with a group of friends. We'd heard the stories, of course the ones about the ghostly cowboy who wandered the woods, about the strange happenings that had plagued the area for years. Most people dismissed them as urban legends, just a collection of old myths passed down by locals. But when you've been around long enough, when you've heard enough of these stories, you start to wonder if there's some truth behind them. The canyon had always been a place of mystery, even in the daylight. There were rumors about the area's history, about a time when the land had been used for cattle ranching, about the cowboy who disappeared without a trace. No one really knew what happened to him, but stories persisted. Some said he had been murdered by outlaws. Others claimed he had simply vanished into the wilderness, never to be seen again. It wasn't until years later that people started whispering about his ghost, about the figure who appeared at dusk, walking through the canyon, looking for something or someone. That night, we were out there just to hike, to test our nerves. It had been a dare, one of those "I bet you won't do it" kind of situations. We made our way through the trees, laughing and joking, unaware of the unsettling quiet that had settled over the canyon. We passed by the creek, where the water flowed swiftly over the rocks, the sound of it filling the space between us. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of our footsteps were swallowed by the thick underbrush, and the forest seemed to close in around us. Then we heard it, a distant sound, something that didn't quite belong in the natural world. At first, it was just a low, almost imperceptible noise, like the creaking of old wood. But it grew louder, sharper, and before long, we realized it was the sound of boots crunching on the dry leaves, the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking in the woods. At first, we thought it was just another hiker, someone else out for a late-night walk. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady, and then we saw him, a figure, standing in the shadows between the trees. At first, we couldn't make him out, just a silhouette against the dark backdrop of the canyon. But as we drew closer, the outline became clearer. A man, dressed in what could only be described as an old-fashioned cowboy outfit, complete with a wide-brimmed hat and boots that seemed to echo in the silence of the night. His face was shadowed, but there was something about his posture, something about the way he stood that sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't moving at first, just standing there, watching us with an unsettling stillness. It felt like we were intruding, like we had stepped into a world we weren't supposed to be in. And as we stood frozen, staring at him, a horrible realization washed over me. He wasn't just any cowboy. He was the cowboy, the one who had haunted the stories, the one people claimed to have seen wandering the canyon after dark. And now, he was standing right in front of us. I should have turned and run. We all should have. But in that moment, we were frozen, paralyzed by a mix of fear and disbelief. The cowboy didn't speak, didn't make a move. He just stood there, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, watching us as though waiting for something. I remember feeling like time had slowed down, like everything around me had faded into the background. The trees, the ground, the air, it all became a blur. All I could see was him. All I could feel was the weight of his gaze, like it was pressing down on me, holding me in place. I don't know how long we stood there. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the silence was broken by a faint rustling in the bushes behind us. It was enough to snap us out of our trance, enough to make us realize that whatever this cowboy was, he wasn't alone. We turned to look, but when we looked back, the cowboy was gone. Just like that, vanished into the shadows of the canyon. We didn't stick around to see if he would return. We turned and ran, stumbling over rocks and roots as we made our way back to the trailhead, hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't speak a word to each other as we hurried down the path, only the sound of our frantic footsteps filling the air. The canyon, which had once seemed so normal, so familiar, now felt like a place that belonged to something else, something darker. We made it back to the car in record time, all of us shaking, our breath coming in short, ragged gasps. We didn't talk much on the way home. The tension was too thick, the fear too fresh. We had all seen the same thing, felt the same unease, and none of us could explain it. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, that the exhaustion from the hike had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in those woods, something that couldn't be explained, something older than time itself. And I could feel it, just beyond the edge of my awareness, waiting for me to return. And I can't help but wonder, is the cowboy still out there? Does he still walk the woods of Black Star Canyon, waiting for someone else to cross his path? I don't have an answer for that, but I do know one thing. If you ever find yourself near Black Star Canyon, I suggest you think twice before venturing too deep. Because out there, in the silence of the woods, there are things that can't be explained, things that are older than time itself. And once you see them, once you feel them watching you, it's a feeling that never really goes away. You may leave the canyon, but the canyon never leaves you. I can still feel it now, the weight of that night pressing on me, a constant reminder of the things that lurk in the dark corners of this world. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can hear the sound of boots crunching on the dry leaves, echoing in the distance. And I know that wherever I go, whatever I do, I'll never forget the cowboy in the canyon. Thank you so much for tuning in to tonight's chilling tale. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and don't let the shadows catch you. Because once you feel their eyes on you, you might never be the same again.